So this evening we'll be talking about really the growth of China, transition from some of these ancient dynasties like the Qin. We'll still be working through different dynasties, but the big change we're going to see today is rapid growth in population and an emergence into the global market in a big way. The Silk Road had existed for centuries previously, but for various reasons that we're going to get into, China as well as Europe began to pursue overseas means to carry goods along the Silk Road. So we'll look at that in a little more detail. So as we're looking at really China's golden age, we're going to look at the Sui, the Tang, and the Song dynasties, as well as the collapse of the Han dynasty. And so way back in chapter 5, at the very end of your chapter, there was a brief comparison between the Han dynasty and the Roman Empire, because the rise and fall of the Han dynasty is very similar to the rise and fall of the Han Empire. So we're going to kind of circle back to look at the very end of this ruling era and then transitioning into some different times. So really, at the end of the Han Dynasty, China fell into a period of division and civil war. There were various nomadic groups, ancestors of the Mongols that had crossed the Gobi Desert and had even gone south of the Great Wall, establishing their own realms in the northern provinces of China. And so, in the south of China, the native form of government and culture continued to be the prevailing system of government, but this near constant civil war and instability later led to this era that we call the era of 6 different dynasties. And so I wouldn't ask you to memorize all these. Of course, it's nice that the tests are open book, but at the same time, we've got several different transitions to look at here. So first off, the collapse of the Han. This had a deep impact on the culture and mindset of the Chinese people. The Confucian principles, establishing hard work, subordination of the individual to the community, were challenged severely. Now, as a result, Chinese intellectuals began to reject Confucianism and turned instead to Taoism and later to Buddhism for answers. And so as Buddhism increased in popularity, it would come in conflict with supporters of Confucianism and Taoism, really for the fact that it came from elsewhere. And this did nothing to stop or even slow the spread of Buddhism, however. And eventually this new faith was assimilated into Chinese culture. So after nearly 4 centuries, China was unified once again. And in 581, when Yuan Shan founded a dynasty called the Sui, he tried to create a unified ideology for the state to enhance efficiency by turning to Taoism and Buddhism. He founded monasteries for both and appointed Buddhist monks to key positions as political advisors. So he was a builder, and his son, Sui Yangdi, continued that vein, constructing a canal from the capital to the Wei and the Yellow Rivers, as well as the Grand Canal, which linked the Yellow and the Yangtze. Now, this canal helped shipments move from the rich rice southern provinces to the densely populated northern provinces. It also allowed troop movements over to provinces that were having trouble. The Sui dynasty came to an abrupt end immediately after Sui Yangdi's death. The emperor was a tyrant, and upon returning from a failed military campaign against Korea, he was murdered in his own palace. General Li Yuan took advantage of this instability and founded a new dynasty, the Tang.
strong centralized government finally returned to China in the year 581 AD, when emperors from the Sui family reunified China. But 37 years later, a revolt of the Chinese people ended the Sui dynasty, and the first in a long line of Tang emperors began to rule China. Under the Tang rulers, the government of China became very highly organized, and more difficult tests were required of those who wished to work for the emperors. And during this era, the capital of China was the great walled city of Xi'an, seen here. However, this city was much more than just the headquarters of the imperial government. It was a thriving center of international trade as well. That was because Xi'an was where the Silk Road to Europe began. And it was from here that during the Tang Dynasty, and even earlier, camels were loaded with bales of silk and other valuable goods for a long, treacherous journey west. The Silk Road actually consisted of several different trade routes, but the main route from Xi'an ended in the cities of Tyre and Antioch on the Mediterranean Sea. It is important to note that it was during the Tang Dynasty that Arab traders who traveled the Silk Road helped spread the brand new faith of Islam across Asia to China.
Li Yaon would only be in power a short time before his son, Tong Taizong, took over. Under Tong Taizong's leadership, the Tong launched a program of internal renewal and external expansion, making it one of the greatest Chinese dynasties. The dynasty extended its control over Tibet, established commercial and diplomatic relations with the states of Southeast Asia, and restored to glory the city of Chang'an, which became the seat of the empire. Korea attempted to adopt the Chinese model, and the Japanese dispatched official missions to China to learn more about the customs and institutions therein. One key to the success of reuniting China was in the decision of Tong leaders to revive many of the Confucian principles that had been abandoned after the fall of the Han. Tong rulers began to draw on the principles of state Confucianism, originally established by the Han as a means of centralizing power at court and weakening the power of the aristocrats. The person most likely responsible for this development was Wu Zaitan, also known as the Empress Wu. She rose to a position of influence in 649 and was able to win appointment as regent by 660. By 690, she was able to declare herself Empress of China. Now, to bolster her claim of legitimacy, Empress Wu cited a Buddhist sutra indicating that women would rule the world after the death of the Buddha. While historians of old hated her for this presumption, more modern historians have argued that she was a very capable ruler and contend that her actions laid the groundwork for the golden age of Tong China. The Tong, like many other dynasties, would fall to corruption. It's possible that prolonged drought also played a role. Now, in 755, rebellious forces briefly seized control of Qianyang. While the Tong overcame the rebellion, they never fully recovered. The loss of power by the centralized government led to chronic instability in the northern and western frontier. In the early 10th century, the Tong collapsed when border troubles with the Khitan, that is, the northern nomadic peoples, began. Now a new dynasty arose, the Song, in 960. The Song rulers encountered more problems defending their territory. Their founding emperor was Song Taizu and was able to organize several rival military commanders, but was unable to reconquer the northwestern part of the country. He established his capital further to the east, where the Grand Canal intersected the Yellow River. While it was politically and militarily weak, the Song nevertheless ruled a period of economic expansion, prosperity, and cultural achievement, and it's therefore considered one of the more successful Chinese dynasties. The Song, however, were never able to overcome the external challenge from the north, and that failure brought about the end of the dynasty. In the early 13th century, the Song formed an alliance with the Mongols, a new nomadic people from the Gobi Desert. Within a few years, the Mongols became a serious threat to China, and after a series of battles and sieges, they announced the creation of a new Huan, or Mongol, dynasty. So, a little about some important new technologies that developed under the last two dynasties that we've looked at. Most importantly was the use of gunpowder and the gun, but also, of course, the blast furnace, the production of steel, the chain pump for irrigation, allowing them to pump water instead of having to rely on moving water downstream through gravitational force. They could pump water to different locations further up. But it's the development of gunpowder that in time led to the creation of explosive weapons like bombs, grenades, small rockets, and cannons. That's going to change the nature of warfare. So during the almost 700 years from the fall of the Sui to the end of the Song, a mature political system based on the principles gradually emerged in China. The development of the system did not reach its height until the Song dynasty. At the center of the Chinese government was the Grand Council. It consisted of representatives from all three authorities: civil, military, and censorate. Under the Grand Council was the Department of State Affairs, composed of ministries responsible for justice, military affairs, personnel, public works, revenue, and rituals. Officials were selected by the use of a civil service system examination, and in the beginning the exam was given only to those from great families, and it was administered at the capital city. The Song were more successful by limiting aristocratic control over the bureaucracy. One way was by making the civil service examination the primary route to an official career. And to reduce the power of the noble families, relatives of individuals serving in the imperial court were prohibited from taking the exam. 3 levels of exams were administered. The first was a qualifying exam, given every year at the provincial capital. Candidates who passed this exam qualified for local bureaucratic positions. Candidates who wished to go on could take the second exam, given at the capital every 3 years. And some took the final exam, given at the imperial palace every 3 years. Those who passed were eligible for high positions in the central government. During the early Tang, the exam included questions on Buddhist and Taoist topics, but by the time of the Song dynasty, these exams were based entirely on Confucian ideas. The system guaranteed that successful candidates would have received a full dose of Confucian political and social ethics. The Song tried to open the system to provide an opportunity for the poor as well as the wealthy, setting up academies at the provincial and district levels. Even with changes to the system, it did not provide equal opportunity for all, nor did it guarantee that the government would be honest. The majority of candidates came from wealthy landowners in the countryside, and nepotism was a large problem because many Chinese people following Confucius held that duty to family was more important than loyalty to the community. Either way, the civil service exam system was an impressive achievement for its day and probably provided a more efficient government and more opportunity for upward mobility than any other civilization at the time. Further, by regulating the content of the exams, the system helped provide China with a cultural uniformity lacking in empires elsewhere in Asia.
Since Emperor Qin, many other dynasties have ruled China. Mother says that not every emperor was perfect, but we've had some great leaders who helped us to grow strong and powerful. Right after Qin died, a new dynasty was started by a peasant named Liu Bang. In the new Han dynasty, the emperor wanted only the smartest and hardest working people to help run his government. It didn't matter what family you were born into. It mattered how smart you were and how well you studied. From that time on, emperors have had special schools all over China. Boys study for years and the tests are really hard to pass. But those who do pass get a good job helping to run our country. This system of finding the best people for the job is called a meritocracy. I just have one problem with this plan. Girls don't get to go to school. We're supposed to stay home and do other things, like help our mothers around the house. But that never stopped my mother. She learned to read and write at home when she was my age, and she's making sure I do the same thing. Oops, it's time to light the lanterns. I need to stop and get ready for our special New Year's dinner. I can't wait to tell you even more the very next chance I get.
Now, during the period of the Sui and the Song, the economy grew considerably. The early Tang tried to reduce the power of the landed nobility and maximize tax revenues by adopting the ancient well-field system, whereby land was allocated to farmers to live in return for tax payments and 3 weeks of labor each year. The Song later returned to these ideals, which allowed rice to become the main food crop for Chinese people. The Chinese urban economy expanded manufacturing and trade. The Chinese mastered the art of manufacturing steel by mixing cast iron and wrought iron. The resulting product was used to manufacture swords, sickles, and even suits of armor. Long-distance trade also expanded along the Silk Road. This road, which is really just a trade route, was composed of a number of different routes. So the Silk Road was so hazardous that shipping goods by sea became increasingly popular because it was safer and just more efficient. Chinese maritime trade was stimulated by the invention of the compass and by improvements in shipbuilding. The Chinese exported tea, silk, and porcelain, and in return they would import wood, precious stones, and cotton. The ports in southern China exported sweet oranges, lemons, and peaches in return for grapes, walnuts, and pomegranates. Some of this trade was a product of the tribute system, which the Chinese rulers used as an element of their foreign policy. The Chinese viewed the outside world as they viewed their own society, as a hierarchy or a pyramid. Rulers of smaller countries along the outside provinces were viewed as younger brothers of the Chinese emperor and owed fealty to him. Foreign rulers who accepted the relationship were required to pay tribute and to promise not to harbor enemies of the Chinese empire. But the foreign rulers also benefited from this relationship. And so this is just a clip from a movie about Genghis Khan. This is a scene of one of the final battles where he established dominance over the different Mongolian tribes. So it's a neat movie. I recommend it, but I just wanted to have that kind of in the background as we talk about one of my favorite peoples, the Mongols. Now, the Mongols succeeded the Song as the rulers of China in the late 13th century. The Mongols were loosely organized into clans and tribes, and even lacked a common name for themselves. Rivalry among the tribes over pasture land, livestock, and loot was very intense. This rivalry increased at the end of the 12th century as a result of a growing population. This challenge was met by the man who came to be known as Genghis Khan. Born to a relatively obscure pastoral people, Genghis Khan gradually unified the Mongol tribes. The army that Genghis Khan unleashed on the world was not exceptionally large. In fact, there were less than 130,000 warriors. However, the tactics of the Mongols set them apart. Mounted warriors could surround their enemies and harass them, luring them into traps where they were ambushed. The Mongols defeated tribal groups to the west and then turned toward the non-Chinese kingdoms of northern China. There they discovered that their adversaries were armed with fire lances and early flamethrower. These inventions, though, did nothing to save China from the Mongols. In 1231, the Mongols attacked Persia and then defeated the Abbasids in Baghdad in 1258. Mongol forces then attacked the Song from the west in the 1260s. Prior to these conquests, the Mongols had been purely nomadic, spending their winters in southern plains and traveling north in the summer. Genghis Khan eventually set up a capital at Karakorum, but prohibited his fellow Mongols from practicing sedentary occupations or even living in cities. Under his successors, though, the Mongols began to adapt to their conquered areas, and Mongol aristocrats began to enter administrative positions. Commoners also took up sedentary occupations as farmers or merchants. The territorial nature of the empire also changed. Tribal custom dictated that when Genghis Khan died, his territory was distributed amongst his heirs and broke up the empire into several separate khanates. Through these khanates, one of his grandsons, Kublai Khan, completed the conquest of the Song and established a new Chinese dynasty called the Huan. And so I just wanted to look briefly at where the Mongols came from, the pattern of conquest by the end of Genghis Khan's lifetime, and how really by the time of his grandson Kublai Khan, all of China was under the reign of Mongols, and really as far west as Persia, as far north as Russia. So these guys had the largest overland empire in human history. So to be fair, the British had them beat if you factor in colonies across oceans, but just one large landmass. The Mongols are distinguished in this way. So under Kublai Khan, Mongol armies reconquered Vietnam and launched fleets against Malay kingdoms in Java, Sumatra, and the islands of Japan. Only the expedition to Vietnam succeeded, however. The Vietnamese would eventually drive them away. The Mongols had more success in governing China, adapting to the Chinese political system and making use of local talents in the bureaucracy. The tripartite division of the administration stayed, as did the 6 ministries. The civil service system was revived in the early 14th century, and the state cult of Confucius was also restored. Culturally, the Mongols were nothing like the Chinese and remained a separate class with their own laws. The highest positions in the bureaucracy were staffed with Mongols, and most commoners retained their traditional religion. The Mongols' greatest achievement, though, was the prosperity they fostered. They continued the relatively tolerant economic policies of the Song and encouraged long-distance trade along the Silk Road, However, the Huan eventually fell victim to the same fate as these other powerful dynasties: corruption. And by the middle of the 14th century, the Huan dynasty had fallen into rapid decline. By the 1360s, unrest through the country put an end to the Huan and formed the Ming dynasty.
China enjoyed years of peace and prosperity. Europe, meanwhile, was plundered by the nomadic hordes China had turned away. But after the Han Dynasty ended in AD 220, their Great Wall was largely neglected and fell into ruins. The northern nomads continued to threaten China for centuries. In the 13th century, one fierce warrior from the Mongol tribe united all the nomadic tribes, becoming the first king of all the nomads. His name was Temujin, but he answered to the name Genghis Khan. Legend has it that the Mongol army could ride for days without dismounting. When food ran low, they sucked the blood of their horses. Genghis Khan inspired such terror, cities would surrender without fight. One summer, when the dried-up river valleys made it easy for horses to cross the Chinese plains, Genghis Khan made his move. A Mongol army of 100,000 warriors invaded the Chinese capital, present-day Beijing. After a long battle, Genghis Khan finally captured the fort, Zhongguan. The nomads now ruled most of China. By 1279, all of China was under Mongol control. One of Genghis Khan's successors, his grandson Kublai Khan, ruled the largest empire the world has ever known. It stretched from China to the borders of Europe. He had no need for a great wall, because he controlled it all. The harsh Mongol rule in China ultimately triggered a popular revolt. The Mongols were overthrown and replaced in 1368 by a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming.
This is China. This country of more than 1 billion people has one of the largest economies in the world. And where there is money, there are merchants. Merchants, or people who buy and sell goods, have been a part of Chinese life for thousands of years. But it wasn't until the 13th century, when the warrior Kublai Khan conquered China, that these merchants became a powerful group. The new emperor knew that he couldn't rule a country as large as China for long with only a few 100,000 soldiers. Kublai Khan needed help, and lots of it. Kublai Khan decided to group all of his subjects into special classes, each with different rights and responsibilities. Kublai Khan's warriors, the Mongols, would be the most powerful class. They would rule the country, live in great estates, and never pay taxes. Peasants living in the north and south would be China's farmers and laborers. Kublai Khan also created another group, the Simun-Gen, or persons with special status. These special people acted as the Mongols' assistants and helped them govern China. While not as wealthy or as powerful as the Mongols, the Simun-Gen were able to use their contacts with people inside and outside of the empire to promote trade. Officials in Kublai Khan's empire were able to provide traders with textiles, tea, and sugar in return for gold and silver. The Simun-Gen changed from officials to merchants. From the days of Kublai Khan to the present, merchants have been an integral part of Chinese life. They have not only traded in goods, they have also helped to spread the wonders of Chinese culture to the rest of the world.
Now, the Mongols were the last and greatest of the nomadic peoples. They came through Central Asia, pillaging and conquering territories with extraordinary speed. We don't exactly know why they came, or even how they came to be so successful. Some argue that their pasture lands on the steppes were exhausted, depleted, while others really just point to the genius of Genghis Khan. Still others cite the use of the organizational unit known as the Ordubs, indicating that the Mongols applied that organization to create a disciplined and highly effective military unit that later used superior horsemanship and blitzkrieg tactics to defeat the enemy. Now, regardless, the Mongols' underlying weaknesses proved fatal. Having difficulty transitioning to sedentary life, and their political systems led to instability. The Mongols' conquest resulted in widespread death and suffering. Nations and empires were destroyed, and irrigation systems laid to waste. And just when it seemed as though things were calming down, the bubonic plague, likely carried by lice hidden in the saddlebags of Mongol horsemen, decimated the population of Europe and the Middle East. Now, few historians would dispute the brutality that characterized Mongol expansion. But some also point out that beyond that, the Mongols also brought an era of widespread peace, known as the Pax Mongolica. And I almost forgot to mention the famous traveler Marco Polo. So Marco Polo was a merchant from Italy and was traveling along the Silk Road as a business person. And he was captured and he was brought before none other than Kublai Khan. And when he told his story and pled his case, Kublai Khan wound up bringing him into his service. And Marco Polo worked for Kublai Khan for nearly 20 years. And then he retired back to Italy. And so he left in peace, went to Italy, and wrote his memoirs. And it's one of the most famous travel stories from this era of the world. And so he reported, perhaps with a bit of bias, but he told of these just fantastic cities in the Far East with this incredible wealth. He wrote about how they were using these black stones to heat their homes. He's talking about coal. But he was most impressed with Kublai Khan's system of government. And he wrote in his book once that a person could carry a bag of gold across the entire Huan Empire in safety because nobody messed with the Mongols. So anyway, they were gathered into a book, and whether he took liberties or not, the stories were just so outlandish. I mean, people just had no facet. So a lot of people just thought he was lying.
By the year 1279, the grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, had overthrown the last emperor of the Song dynasty and established the Mongol Yuan dynasty. It was during the Yuan dynasty that China achieved its maximum size by being united with the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan. And it was also during the Yuan dynasty that a man named Marco Polo became the first European to write a book about China. Marco Polo came from Venice, a rich and powerful Italian city-state that controlled a mighty trading empire. In fact, nearly all of the luxury goods that reached the West on the Silk Road ended up being carried to Europe on Venetian ships. As a result, Venice pretty much controlled the prices of those goods. In the year 1271, Marco Polo sailed from Venice to the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, and then for 3 years he traveled down the Silk Road to China. After spending nearly 2 decades in that country and getting to know Kublai Khan quite well, Marco Polo returned to Venice, loaded down with valuable treasures from the emperor as well as a letter to the Pope. And the book Marco Polo wrote about his travels inspired Europeans to learn more about Chinese inventions, customs, and institutions of government.
So the Ming brought a new era of greatness to China. And under a series of strong rulers, China extended its rule into Mongolia and Central Asia. Emperor Yang Li strengthened the Great Wall and pacified nomadic tribes that had troubled China in previous centuries. A tributary relationship was also established in Korea. Now, like the Mongols, the Ming turned to traditional Confucian institutions as a means of ruling their vast empire. These included the six ministries and the use of civil service exams and the traditional divisions of the empire, that is, provinces, districts, and counties. But now we're going to talk a little about the rise of the Ming. Now, a peasant's son, Hong Wu, commanded the rebel army that drove the Mongols out of China in 1368. That year, he became the first Ming emperor. Hong Wu continued to rule the former Huan capital of Nanjing in the south. He began reforms designed to restore agricultural lands devastated by war, to erase all traces of the Mongol past, and to promote China's power and prosperity. Hong Wu's agricultural reforms increased rice production and improved irrigation. He also encouraged fish farming and growing commercial crops such as cotton and sugarcane. Hong Wu's death in 1398 led to a power struggle. His son Yongle emerged victorious. Yongle continued many of his father's policies, although he moved the royal court to Beijing.
When the Forbidden City emerged from the northern Chinese plain at the start of the 15th century, it was the biggest complex of palaces in the world. It still is. It was designed to reflect the eternal glory of the Ming emperors. When the work was over, the people vanished, leaving the city to an emperor and the court that served him. All of the emperor's power flowed from this room. Around it, a fabled 9,999 rooms. The yellows were for power, the reds for good luck, and everywhere the imperial dragons to bring the rains and make the land prosper. There were 18 provinces in the empire, and intelligence reports and tax ledgers arrived in the Forbidden City every day. An empire of 150 million people, Han Chinese, Mongol, Manchu, was governed from here by the world's oldest and most sophisticated bureaucratic machine. And the emperor was at its head.
Now, in 1405, the emperor sent a fleet of Chinese trading ships under Admiral Zhang He through the Strait of Malacca and out into the Indian Ocean. There they traveled as far west as Africa, stopping at ports in South Asia. The fleet was incredibly impressive, including 28,000 sailors and 62 ships. So here's a picture of Zhang He's flagship next to Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria. So it begs the question, why did he go on these voyages? And then why did they eventually abandon them? So everywhere he stopped, he brought gifts, established diplomatic relations, and really put China on the world stage. First question, why? Some have pointed out that the emperor was naturally curious. And they point to these voyages and the fact that they returned with goods and information from all over the known world. Others argue that economic profit was the main reason, believing that these voyages were aimed at strengthening China's alliances with trading partners, while also clearing the seas of pirates. The expeditions ended shortly after Yang Lo's death, although historians don't know why. Some believe that Yang Lo moved the capital, and this caused a focus on the rising threat of nomadic forces rather than sea exploration. This focus inward would shift the balance of power back to northern China, and this would cause China to stay isolated for another 400 years. Other scholars argue that the voyages were just no longer necessary. Whatever the case, the decision affected China's relationship with the rest of Asia for the next several centuries. Because after Yang Li's death, and after these voyages discontinued, for one, the Chinese government just withdrew and became more inward. And for example, the capital was moved further inland. Commerce with the outside world declined, though didn't cease. But as we're beginning to wrap up, I wanted to look at a few important elements of Chinese culture. And so, perhaps the most important is the development of paper and woodblock printing. So, the Chinese were the first to use paper in the sense that we think of as modern paper. And they were the first to develop a system of movable type. Now, the printing press by Johann Gutenberg is going to be an improvement on this system. But to be fair, it was the Chinese who used it first. And so this is just going to make written works more affordable and accessible and more prolific. So poetry, above all, was the most effective in expressing Chinese literary talents. Chinese poems celebrated the beauty of nature, the changing of the seasons, and the joys of friendship and drink. The novel also began to appear as a form of literature, and two of the most famous were the romance of the Three Kingdoms and the Tale of the Marshes. Now, painting also flourished. Chinese artists painted landscapes, and rather than depicting the actual realistic shape of a specific mountain, they tried to portray the idea of the mountain. Their paintings were displayed on long scrolls of silk or paper that were attached to a wooden bar. They varied in length from 3 to 20 feet. The paintings were unfolded slowly so that the eye could enjoy each segment. By the 10th century, painters began to eliminate color, preferring the challenge of capturing the distilled essence of the landscape in black and white. Ceramics and porcelain were also forms of art. Most notable is the cobalt blue and the white porcelain, usually identified with the Ming Dynasty.
This is Kaifeng City, 400 miles south of Beijing. Around 960 AD, one of China's golden ages blossomed here into the Song Dynasty, a 300-year period ripe with innovation. Kaifeng was the dynasty's first capital. This city of nearly 4.5 million people has been an important center of Chinese civilization for about 3,000 years. But even today, the city retains many features specific to the Song Dynasty's culture. At 7 o'clock each night, the city's food market sets up in a mad rush, each vendor hoping to be the first to dish up his wares. This tradition of eating out began during the Sung dynasty, when expanding commerce brought money and people to the capital. The world's first restaurants sprung up, and food like dumplings and noodles became widely available to the masses for a small price. The architecture in Kaifeng's new historic district is based on the style of the Sung capital. This temple lies at the northern end of the city's historic district. It was built in honor of emperors who ruled Kaifeng during its imperial days. The location was chosen because buried far below this building are the ruins of the Sung imperial palace. This is a model of the ancient palace grounds. Hidden among the impressive walls and buildings is one of mankind's greatest inventions, a 30-foot tower the inventor called a cosmic engine, the world's first mechanical clock. This scene is a monument to one of the greatest breakthroughs of intellectual history. The fellow on my left here, Su Sung, was a mathematician, astronomer, and all-round genius who's explaining his invention, a mechanical water clock, to the Emperor Zhao Xu in the year 1092. Early Chinese astronomers often equated the heavens with water, since stars seem to drift across the night sky like a giant flowing river. They frequently used water to drive simple machines, which mimicked the motion of the stars. The problem they faced was keeping the mechanism operating at a precise rate. Su Sung solved that problem with a mechanism which today is known as a mechanical escapement. Inside Su Sung's armillary clock, a stream of water turned a large wheel equipped with cups. As the measured weight of water forced one cup down, the wheel moved forward one cog. A series of weights and locks kept it from recoiling or from moving forward too quickly. This mechanical escapement captured time in precise increments. A chain drive, another Chinese invention, rotated the armillary at the top. One complete rotation for each day, replicating the movement of the stars. Although this machine was primarily used as an astronomical showpiece, its mechanical escapement was the foundation of modern mechanical clocks. In a few hundred years, China would drop this technology while the West, much later, went on to create clocks using weights and springs instead of water to drive the escapement.
Now, Buddhism and Taoism appealed to those who were searching for a more emotional and spiritual satisfaction than Confucianism could provide. As Buddhism attracted more followers, it began to take on Chinese characteristics and divided into segments. The Chan sect called for mind training and a strict regimen as a means of seeking enlightenment. The Pure Land sect stressed the role of devotion, an approach that was more appealing to the ordinary person. The Tantric sect emphasized the importance of magical symbols and rituals in seeking a preferred way to enlightenment. The White Lotus sect adopted a form of rebel movement, seeking political reform or the overthrow of a dynasty. By encouraging young Chinese to abandon their rice fields and to seek refuge in wisdom in monasteries, Buddhism was undermining the foundation of society. Other religions and philosophies slowly moved in to challenge Buddhism. And so, a little about the decline of the practice of Buddhism and Taoism. This is particular to the court or the central government in China. They were always viewed as outside philosophies. Confucianism was always tied into the essence and culture of the Chinese way. But there was also economic reasons. I mean, these monasteries owned incredible amounts of land, and these lands were exempt from taxation. Because people gave to these monasteries, such as people tied to their various religious churches and whatnot, these places held a lot of money, and various religious institutions throughout history have had histories of corruption, and the Buddhists and Taoists were no different. There was a backlash against Buddhism and Taoism throughout central China, and temples were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Buddhists were displaced and forced to leave. And I guess the main reason at the end of it is just this political and ideological difference, that these ideas represented something outside. And so, like I said, after Yang Li's death, China drew more inward. And so we see a new form of Confucianism called Neo-Confucianism, or the investigation of things that filled the void. These new doctrines, with their fundamental purpose to unite the metaphysical speculations of Buddhism and Taoism with the pragmatic Confucian approach to society. The primary contributor was Zhu Shai, who accepted the division of the world into a material world and a transcendent world called the Supreme Ultimate. The Supreme Ultimate was equivalent to the Tao, or the Way. Now, traditional society in China was complicated. It was almost exclusively rural, with a small urban class of business people, skilled workers, and then workers dependent on the state. Cities were no longer primarily administrative centers. They included business people, skilled workers, homeless people, and entertainers. In the countryside, there was a more complex mixture of landed gentry and free farmers, sharecroppers, and landless workers. There was also a class of base people, actors, butchers, and prostitutes, who possessed only limited rights. Now, under the early Tang, a powerful, noble family not only possessed a significant part of the national wealth, but also dominated high positions in the government. During the Song dynasty, the rise of the landed gentry became most influential. These landowners, or gentry, controlled much of the wealth and produced the candidates for bureaucracy. Upward and downward mobility between the scholar gentry class and the remainder of the population was not uncommon, and may have been a key factor in the stability and longevity of the system. Aspects of daily life also changed. Entertainment expanded with playing cards and chess. New forms of transportation, such as the paddle wheel board and the horseback riding with the saddle and stirrup, were introduced. During the Ming Dynasty, the vast majority of Chinese people still lived off the land in villages that varied in size. Most Chinese rarely left their native village. This isolation was psychological and physical, as most Chinese identified with their immediate environment and had difficulty envisioning themselves living beyond their hedges. The most important unit was the family. The ideal was for extended families, 3 generations or more, to live together under one roof, especially in the southern provinces where rice farming was very labor intensive. Chinese village architecture reflected these traditions. Most family dwellings were simple, consisting of 1 or 2 rooms, constructed of dried mud, stone, or brick, with roofs of thatch or tile, and floors of packed dirt. Within the family unit, the eldest male ruled supreme. He had traditional legal rights over his wife, and if she did not provide him with a male heir, he was permitted to take a second wife. Children were expected to obey their parents in all things and filial piety was viewed as an absolute moral good. The tradition of male superiority continued into the medieval era. Women were not permitted to take the civil service exam and were discouraged from following any profession outside the home. The wife had no recourse to divorce. As the old saying went, marry a chicken, follow the chicken, marry a dog, follow the dog. Wealthy Chinese might keep concubines who lived in separate rooms in the house and sometimes competed with the lawful wife for precedence. Males were considered to be superior, and female children were less desirable because they could not undertake heavy field work. A second source of marital bait during the Song period was the promise of a bride with tiny bound feet. The process of foot binding carried out on girls as young as 5 until they reached the age of 13 was excruciatingly painful, as it bent and compressed the foot to half its normal size by imprisoning it in restrictive bandages. Young girls had their feet bound to ensure that they had tiny feet and hence were better candidates for marriage. There were exceptions to the low standing of women in Chinese society, though. Women had substantial property rights and retained control over their dowries even after divorce or widowhood. Wives often took control of the household accounts and assumed the primary responsibility of raising the children. Now, the Tang and the Ming dynasties are a great era in the age of literature. We see various themes like themes of Buddhism and Taoism combined with Confucianism. There are many elements, many great works of porcelain and sculpture from this period. But like I was saying before, in terms of literature, the most significant advances here were paper woodblock writing. Oh, excuse me, I already covered that. Here we go. Now, painting also flourished. Chinese artists painted landscapes, and rather than depicting the actual realistic shape of a specific mountain, they tried to portray the idea. And I wanted to show you just a few examples before we close. See if these still work. Yeah, so these are just some examples of painting in the Song and Huan dynasties. Let's see. Here's this concept of the idea of a landscape. Let's see if I can find one that looks good. Yeah, again, realism was not the point here. It's more capturing the idea. So I guess you could call this a form of impressionism. Yeah, sorry, some of these links are a little dated. Nope, not working. Okay, so that's all I got for this evening. And guys, sorry again. When I get the hiccups, for some reason, I just struggle. But that's something I can't seem to